This presentation was recorded at the Best Practices for Pollinators Summit. For more information, contact pollinatorfriendly.org.
My name is Sarah Foltz Jordan. I've been involved in the summit for many years. My background and training is mostly in entomology and conservation biology. I worked for the Xerces Society for about 15 years, and yet my hobbies, kind of family life, community involvement has largely centered around mushrooms, especially edible mushrooms. And so, of course, I'm often thinking about the intersection between these two groups, but it's been kind of challenging because in the mushroom world, insects are kind of thought of as gross or bad. And there's very little discernment between the different types of insects that are using mushrooms. Either a mushroom is buggy or it's not. And in the insect conservation world, there's just very little conversation at all about this topic or these types of organisms, even though the fungivorous insects far outnumber our pollinators, for example, and they're also no less threatened than pollinators. There are conservation strategies that could benefit them. And I think there's a lot of really interesting parallels between the pollinator conservation world and this world of fungivorous insects. And I think that those parallels can maybe help guide the way or pave the way. So that's why you're hearing about mushrooms at a pollinator conservation conference. I have brought some of this material to mushrooming audiences, trying to encourage folks to think about mushrooms as more than just food for us, but also food for other wildlife. But this is the first time that I've attempted to bring this topic to an insect conservation audience. So bear with me, and thank you again for being interested in this. I'll start by just putting this into perspective through geological time. You can see we haven't been here very long relative to terrestrial fungi, and of course, insects and mollusks. And looking at this, I guess, makes me really curious about the drivers of diversification in the fungi. We have so many. I got into mushrooms because of all the fantastic colors, shapes, life histories, tree associations, wide range of edibility for us. I love to eat mushrooms. And if you're going to eat mushrooms, you have to start to learn them. But I really think that the drivers of that diversity are likely our insects and mollusks. They're what mushrooms have co-evolved with. And I think another parallel here is just thinking about how you can't really understand flowering plants without understanding the pollinators, and vice versa. And I think that's true in this world as well. This photograph and illustration is showing the first fossil of a mushroom, of a cap and stalk mushroom. Sorry, not the first, the oldest fossil of a cap and stalk mushroom that we know of. This was found at a time when mammals were barely on the planet, and insects were very well established and diverse. Okay, quick overview on these groups. Actually, there's a lot of similarities between the insects and the fungi. They are both historically underappreciated, currently also underappreciated, but both have gotten attention for being vastly important in ecosystems, performing so many ecosystem services that we can't even begin to describe or understand. And they are both often credited with being the fabric of life, holding the earth together, and many other wonderful things. Both groups are also highly diverse. Insects, we have a pretty good sense of how many millions, 5.5 million species. Fungi, the range is very much, our estimates vary more widely, but we have a lot. And for comparison, plants, only about 400,000 species. So both groups are also highly abundant, really taking up a lot of biomass in terrestrial ecosystems. And like this previous slide showed, they've cohabited for a really long time. So not surprisingly, the associations between fungi and insects are among the most species-rich, diverse, and complex in terrestrial ecosystems. This photo is showing one of my favorite beetles. It's called the pleasing fungus beetle, also a very cute name, and it feeds almost exclusively on oyster mushrooms. A little more background on these interactions. Okay, so we have interactions that include mutualisms, where both the fungus and the insect are benefiting. Commensalisms, where one benefits and the other is maybe neutral, and predation parasitism, where one benefits and the other maybe suffers. How are invertebrates benefiting? Okay, so they're getting often food from the mushroom and or habitat. How are fungi benefiting? They are often getting dispersed by insects, and sometimes even very carefully dispersed, where the insect has special body parts designed to, almost like baskets, that carry spores and mushroom mycelium, and then those insects will intentionally inoculate the mushroom in the right place. We also have, well, actually, I'll talk you through this photo on the right. So what you're looking at are leafcutter ants, and they are one of the most well-studied classic examples of fungal insect interactions. And what they do is cut these leaves and bring them back to their nests, and they chew up the leaves and then inoculate the leaves with fungi. And then that fungus is something that they use for food. They take very good care of their fungal crop, weeding it, using the equivalent of pesticides, keeping, antimicrobials, to keep their crop clean, and all of that. So that's kind of the first farming, also, well, not quite the first, but an early example of agriculture in insects. Okay, this last bullet here, the entomopathogenic fungi, this is a huge group of insects that actually a huge group of fungi that parasitize insects. So in this case, the fungus is benefiting by getting nutrition, habitat, and often dispersal by that insect. Okay, a lot of examples of entomopathogenic fungi, really quite wild examples. You can see some of the photographs here, but I will just sum it up by saying there's thousands of species of fungi that do this in quite a few different groups, and they infect quite a few different groups of insects, a lot of Lepidoptera, Hymenoptera, a lot of our flies. You can see this. I see this commonly on flies, but I want to show you another example that I think you all have maybe have already seen or have great chance of seeing if you're here in the Midwest or in the Northeast. So I'll talk you through this. You're looking at a goldenrod soldier beetle, and these beetles are commonly infected by a particular type of fungus. Once infected, the beetle will go to the top of the flower or the plant and use its mandibles and tightly grip the plant, and then they die. Okay. And after death, 15 to 22 hours after death, the fungus fruits out of the abdomen, forcing the elytra and the wings open into a mating posture. So this position on the top of the plant and the way the fungus physically manipulates the body greatly increases the chance that the fungal infection will be picked up by healthy beetles, because this is exactly where healthy beetles are feeding and looking for mates. And this can be quite common. One Midwest study found the infection rate was about 20%. And yeah, this is considered a relationship where the fungus benefits and the insect suffers. But I think if you look at the population level, you could also argue that the fungus might actually be benefiting the insect by culling out males that would, you know, with an IQ level that would prompt them to go mate with a dead insect. Okay, I'm going to talk through some terms here. And it's a lot more simple than it looks. So bear with me. In green, I just want to take a minute and distinguish between microfungi. So those are the ones like the molds and the yeasts and a lot of others where the spore producing structures are microscopic. Macrofungi are the ones that you all are probably thinking about, the ones that make mushrooms that are visible with the naked eye. Okay, the next term is fungivorous or mycophagous. These both mean the same thing, feeding on fungi. Very important word I want you all to remember. And I'll come back to this a lot today. Yeah, and I wish I could see a show of hands of like which of these words you like better. Mycophagous is more typically used in the literature anyway, but I feel like fungivorous is a little more intuitive because we're all used to herbivory and herbivores. But anyway, you can pick and choose what you like. Okay, these next three terms in blue are describing the level of the degree to which this fungivorous insect needs fungi. Okay, so mycetobionts are those that require fungi. That is their sole food. Mycetophiles are those that love, I think of them as they love mushrooms. Mycetophile, they love mushrooms. But the alternative food can be used. Sorry, there's a little glitch on my slide there. Okay, and then mycetoxines are those that don't depend on fungus as a primary food source, but they frequently prey on species who do. Okay. The next three terms in purple describe the degree to which a fungivorous insect specializes on particular host mushrooms. So these terms, if you listen to Heather's talk on Tuesday, these terms are very similar to the language that we use to describe the pollen specialization in bees. So in the fungal world, you can have monophagous, where an insect just has one fungus that it feeds on, typically at the genus level. Oligophagous, where there's narrowed feeding requirements, and then polyphagous, where it seems like they're feeding on a lot of different things. All right, so I want to talk a little bit more about the use of mushrooms as a food resource and pitch a question to you, I guess. Are mushrooms something that you would want to have your survival hinging on? And I'm guessing I love mushrooms. Okay, I really, really love mushrooms. I eat mushrooms almost every day, hundreds of different kinds, and also have the luxury of lots of preservation methods. But I would not want to have my survival hinging on mushrooms. And the reason is, let me advance this. The reason is they're so unpredictable. They are they have seasonal yearly fluctuations in fruiting. Even if you have your spots, you know what grows in a certain place, it's really, really difficult to predict when mushrooms are going to appear. And sometimes there's some places I've been in for years and never seen a certain mushroom, and then it is just everywhere in some given year. So unpredictable in terms of timing, also patchy distribution. They're spatially unpredictable. Also, they're short-lived, very ephemeral. They have sudden appearance, very rapid growth, and then very rapid decomposition. So you kind of are racing the clock with mushrooms. I love this word, papawi. It's an indigenous word for, a Native American word for, often used for mushrooms by some tribes, but it translates to swelling up in stature suddenly and silently from an unseen source of power. It's particularly suitable when referring to fungi. They are also very habitat specific. All the field guides, if you're looking at a mushroom, there's a description of where it grows. And often if I'm trying to identify something, knowing where it was really helps in the identification, but also makes them a little bit more challenging, again, as a food resource. Mushrooms are notorious for having toxins. That can be a really challenging thing if you're trying to eat them. It can also be a really good thing if you've evolved to be able to handle the toxins that other organisms can't. This next bullet, nutritional value, I laugh about because it's the same in the insect literature and in the human information. People are always debating if mushrooms are of low nutritional value or a really excellent food source. But with insects, we know that they do have everything necessary to support insect life. So they're rich in carbohydrates and proteins, and a lot of insects can survive on them. Here are just a few examples of habitat specificities. A lot of species are mycorrhizal with certain tree types, or grow on the dead plant tissue of particular species. And now I'm going to jump in a little bit more to this topic of mycophagy. And I will start by saying this is a vastly underexplored area of research, despite having really important influence on community structure and function. But lucky for us, there was a recent global review of this topic that was published, where they basically did a literature review using those terms I just taught you, the mycophagy and fungivory, and they pulled out the actual observations from over 200 studies and then grouped them into these categories, and they narrowed their focus to observations in which both the fungal genus and the invertebrate genus were known or recorded. So there's some biases with this data set, of course, as well. But I wanted to talk you through it. So just looking at this big overview, you can see that the beetles are a really important group of fungivores, also the flies, but a lot of other insect groups as well, and non-insects like our mollusks and mites and millipedes. And I'm going to move on and talk you through specific examples of what's going on in some of these key groups. Okay, starting with the Coleoptera, the beetles. Boy, so beetles are the most diverse group of animals on Earth. They've evolved to feed on pretty much everything. However, there is little doubt that fungivory and saprophagy, which is kind of eating decaying dead things, is the ancestral diet. There are thousands of species of fungivorous species from many different beetle families that are still extant today. A lot of these families, the common names are quite endearing. So endomycids, these are handsome fungus beetles. Irritilids are the pleasing fungus beetles. Mycetophages are the hairy fungus beetles. Ceoids are the minute tree fungus beetles. So the names really reflect their dietary preferences. The best studied in the beetles are the ambrosia and bark beetles, and these are kind of like those ants I talked through earlier. These are beetles that cultivate microfungi within wood, and they have these special pouches that they use to carry the fungal propagules around. And they've gotten a lot of attention as more as forest pests than probably anything else, but still pretty interesting. Beetles are attracted to a lot of different stages of fungus. So there's some that are colonizers and they'll take a fresh mushroom, and there's some that are more like you all are probably familiar with carrion beetles. They like a mushroom when it's really rotted. They also specialize on different parts. Some eat spores, some eat mycelium, some eat the fruiting body. And the beetles have been a really important group in studying the degree to which an individual insect might specialize on a particular type of mushroom. Some of them have really narrow requirements, some feed more broadly. And yeah, I think I'll talk you through some examples as we go on. Okay, so here's my first species I wanted to tell you about. This is the forked fungus beetle, and it has a very narrow feeding requirement on artist conch and a few other polypores. So the picture on the right is showing what the mushroom looks like. That's my baby sitting on this big polypore that we have in our woods. The mushroom is common. The insects are these beetles are fairly common. I've seen them many times. But I'd never stumbled upon this, what you're looking at on the left, a couple summers ago, and I had never seen this. Okay, so that if you look closely, you can see, and what I saw was there's two beetles on top of each other. And I wish I could show you the video because they were flicking, like doing this little flicking thing that actually made a sound. And my first thought was that they were mating. But if you look closely, I have more pictures. They're actually facing the wrong way. So I looked this up, and somebody had actually done a study on this in the 50s. And what they found was that what this beetle is doing is considered like a pre-copulatory courtship behavior. And it can go on for hours. I didn't watch mine that long, but it may or may not result in mating, but it definitely precedes mating. Okay, so this is always, you all are laughing. I know. If you didn't think there was anything happening on a mushroom, I mean, you can think again. The degree to which these insects have, it's just amazing. Okay, so this researcher described this behavior as happening at night, and all of his research was done at night. And I saw it during the day, so I don't know. I think I have some more, yeah, it gets more interesting too. So this is another study where somebody looked at the male-male interactions in this beetle. So, and when I saw it too, actually, there's always some males hanging around, watching, and sometimes getting involved. So what you're looking at here is two different males on top. The males are polymorphic in body size and in horn length. And yeah, well, obviously they're competing for females here. And another interesting thing on this beetle is that the size of the male body is correlated with the size of the mushroom that the male develops on. And yeah, it just makes me think about how our forestry practices, whether or not we're leaving these big trees, can influence the size of the mushroom, which in turn influences the body size of these males and these courtship interactions that we're looking at here. There's so much more to say on that beetle, but I think I'm going to move on. Okay, another type of beetle. These are the staphylinids, the row of beetles. They are a hyper-diverse group. So insects are the largest group of animals. Most of those insects are beetles. Most of the beetles are staphylinids. They're also an ancient group, and fungivory was the basal condition. A lot of them are now predaceous, but a lot of them still feed on fungi. When I see staphylinids on mushrooms, I never really know what they're doing. They might be eating other insects. They might be eating fungi. But I was really excited to see this one. This is such a handsome beetle, by the way, with these bright, it reminds me of like it's wearing a little tuxedo. But this one was actually feeding on the mushroom tissue, which was exciting to me. And they do this thing where it's called pre-oral digestion of food, but they gather the mushroom tissue and secrete fluids on it prior to actually consuming it. They carry it around. Sometimes they'll tuck it in a little crevice. So kind of like cooking or fermenting. Another example here, the oxyporous, I see these really commonly as well. The adults court, mate, oviposit, their whole lives revolve around mushrooms. They have a very short life cycle, kind of racing the clock with the mushroom that's going to decompose quickly. They've also evolved parental care. Angela mentioned this with some of the bugs a few minutes ago. But when you see parental care in an insect, it is typically related to the fact that there's a lot of dangers, and it's really important for that mother or father to stay with the offspring to protect them from predators or parasitoids. But in this case, parental care is considered to be driven by the fact that the mushrooms that they're feeding on are a very rich and very rare resource. So it's pretty important for the parents to hang out on that mushroom and prevent other insects from using the resource. Here's another example, the handsome fungus beetle. These beetles they look like lady beetles kind of, and they're actually closely related to lady beetles, but they have split off and they feed exclusively on fungi, and sometimes have really specific relationships. This is one that feeds primarily on the split gill, which I think is one of the most beautiful mushrooms we have. You can see the larvae on the right, and I'm showing a picture of Cardi Raper, who she was a scientist who discovered that this mushroom has 23,000 different mating types. And yeah, I had the pleasure of meeting her a few years ago. Okay, here's another story. So I collect a lot of turkey tail every year, and that's a medicinal mushroom. It's also really good tasting. And I, at one point, went to the cupboard to pull out this jar of turkey tail and found that I had what was a jar was just a pile of grass and thousands of little beetles crawling around in there. So here's the beetle, a little closer look. And turns out these are cyst beetles, so minute tree fungus beetles that feed almost exclusively on Trametes. And once again, there's a really neat paper that someone did looking a little more closely at the biology of this beetle. So this was in the 60s, and the researcher noticed that there were unusual sex ratios in some populations of the beetles, where females were the male-female ratio in populations in Asia were what you would expect, like 50-50. But in the Western US and over in the Midwest, males became more rare, and in the Midwest, males were absent. So he did some rearing to reveal that this beetle actually exhibits parthenogenesis, which is a phenomenon in which females give birth to females without any mating. What's going on? Why is that happening? Well, he talked about this in terms of the cost of mating, so it can, there's benefits to mating too. But the costs of mating are, it can be hard to find a mate. It takes a lot of time. Courtship is costly. And then also when you're reproducing, if you're parthenogenic, all of your offspring are reproductives. They're all females who can continue to give birth. If you're mating, half your offspring are males. So he explained, the most interesting part to me was he explained these female-only populations in the Midwest in terms of forest cover in the Midwest being considerably fragmented by agriculture. And that habitat fragmentation drove the insect to no longer have it be worth it for them to invest in mating, with the potential challenges of finding a mate and those mating costs. Which in the 60s, I mean, what would you call the Midwest now? If it, considerably fragmented in the 60s. But just another example of how our actions on the ground are potentially having really, really complicated influences on the insects around us. Okay, moving on to the flies. Thousands of species in many different families exhibit fungivory. Of these, the mycetophilids, the fungus-loving flies, or fungus gnats, are the largest group. We have over 3,500 species, which this number might look familiar to some of you because we have roughly that same number of bees from all the different families in the United States. Okay. The fungus gnats are well studied because they're important pests in cultivated and wild mushrooms. They also have a long fossil record. This photo on the right is showing a territorial male who has found a mushroom, and he's protecting that mushroom from other males flying by and waiting for the love of his life to notice him. The photo up on top is a more of a gnat-like fly dipping her ovipositor into a fungus. Here's the life cycle. Boy, what I want to point out here, I think, is just the majority of the life is spent in the fungus. Really rapid development of these foreign stars of larvae. Pupation is happening in the soil, and then the adult takes flight and looks for her host. You can have multiple generations a year or just one. Typically in this climate, my understanding is that the adult stage is what's overwintering. And yeah, this is a really cool photo of these adult fungus gnats overwintering inside of the hollow stem of a carrot family plant, which I thought was neat because we talk so much at Xerces about, and elsewhere, about the importance of stems for nesting bees. They're also providing resources for fungivorous insects. We do have a good understanding of the range of host specialization in this group. There was a 26 study that reared out thousands of gnats from over 400 different types of fungi, representing 38 different fly species. And what they found was that the flies have a continuum of host specialization, but that there was far more specialization than expected. And in most cases, these flies were preferring only one or two different mushroom genera. And then even in the flies that were polyphagous, they were using, one of them was using 22 different species of mushrooms. They still had certain mushrooms that they were avoiding, even though those mushrooms were common in the environment and used by other gnats. I want to take a closer look at boletes. If you're a mushroom hunter, you're probably really familiar with boletes, how delicious they are, and also how buggy they tend to be. The flies that are at least partially responsible for how buggy boletes are. Look kind of like this, kind of like a housefly. And the larvae have a narrow diet, just feeding on boletes, and they, yeah, I mean, one of the most interesting things to me here is that at least some of them have been found to have pupae that can hibernate twice, in response to dry seasons. So that gives me a little bit of hope with climate change and with just how unpredictable mushrooms are in general, but especially in the face of climate change, that these insects at least have some degree of resilience. And yeah, another interesting thing here is that the flies, there's a lot of different species in this group, and they exhibit niche partitioning, where some species will lay their eggs at the base of the mushroom, and some in the cap, and some at the place where the cap meets the stalk, as a way to kind of share the same resource and all get along. Another group here, the Columbella, the springtails. Jennifer and Steph talked about this group on Tuesday, and I guess I'll just add that they're typically considered generalist feeders, but there has been more and more evidence of them having really specific preferences or even requirements, and that the type of fungi that they choose can have significant influences on their reproductive fitness, like their eggs that they're laid. And they're also, these are little insects, but they're playing a really big role in influencing the community structure of fungi in the soil by, again, selectively grazing on certain fungi, allowing others to thrive. This photo that you're looking at is of some Columbella that I saw in a young turkey tail, and they're definitely head down grazing on this mushroom, and aggregating in certain areas. I don't know why, if that was like a specific microclimate, if the food feeding was best over there, or the being in a group made them safer. Not sure. Fungivorous in snails and slugs is my next topic. So I like these photos because I think the one on the left could probably win a photo contest. People love snails. People love pictures of snails on mushrooms. And then the one on the right is probably hard for a lot of people to look at. Definitely wouldn't call that beautiful, but I would. And I really like this slug on the top because you can see the little tentacles are coming out, the little eye stalks. And you really have to be patient. If you want to do slug photography, you really have to be patient because they initially will retract all of that. And then as they get comfortable, I think I have another picture here, they'll release or extend those eye stalks, and it's quite beautiful. Okay, so with slugs, I think my main message is they're doing more good than we think. There's a recent study that found slugs are carrying a huge number of spores in their digestive tract. And they're also distributing those spores, so carrying them to appropriate sites where they can establish colonies. And that dispersal, I haven't really talked about fungi spore dispersal yet, but typically we think of spore dispersal as being largely windborne in the fungi, but we're learning a lot more about the importance of insects, and in this case slugs, in doing that dispersal and moving the spores farther, and also moving them to select sites where the spores are more likely to succeed. And here we're looking at the germination rate of spores from slug feces versus from a control where the spores were just deposited on a piece of paper. And two different edible species, the oysters and the honey mushrooms, and you can see that the spores excreted by slugs had a significantly higher germination rate than the control spores, which you'd imagine would impact the ongoing fitness of the mushroom. Here we're looking at kind of that idea that I posed earlier of how have insects and mollusks potentially influenced the morphology of mushrooms. But both of these mushrooms have what's called a partial veil, where there's this flap of tissue covering the gills and the spores in a young mushroom. And then that opens up in older mushrooms, which may be a way to prevent slugs and insects from eating the spores when they're unripe, but allowing that entry when the spores are ripe. You can see that type of thing in quite a few different mushrooms. This is fun. So Rasulas are a genus of mushroom that are ubiquitous and very diverse. And as far as their edibility, some of them are really good and some of them are not edible or not palatable in any way. And it's a little bit hard to tell. You have to do, if you know it's a Rasula, then it's perfectly safe to do a tiny taste test on your tongue and you're checking for certain tastes. And these were some that had passed that taste test. So we knew they were edible. But we were doing a taste test to see, you know, which of them are actually delicious. And you can see some of the comments over here. This is with my family, but so we've got one that's delish, steak flavored. Wow, 5 stars. And then we've got bitter, what else? Here's one hot. Sarah spit it out. Okay, so wide range, but our favorite was this one, which is also the slug's favorite. So got a lot in common with slugs. And here I was just trying to get a nice photo of this mushroom, like a field guide style photo, and it's impossible because the slugs come out at night and really devour it. Here's a burning question. How can you tell the difference between slug and small mammal fungivorous? Tooth marks. That's the answer, which you can see on the right. And again, in this photo on the gills. And I see this a lot where squirrels or chipmunks will put mushrooms up into trees to dry them for the winter. Another group are the moths. You probably think of moth larvae as being herbivorous because most of them are, but fungus feeding has evolved in certain groups, the Tineids and then the Metalectra, along with others. Here's one that I saw feeding on a guild mushroom, and that same genus feeding on a polypore. Looks like this one looks like a little inchworm when it's crawling. There's one butterfly known to feed on mushrooms. This is a pretty exciting discovery in Costa Rica. There's also a group of bugs, the Eratidae. So this is the same group that Angela was talking about. These are true bugs, but this specific family feeds on fungi. They're not your ordinary fungivore. They've got that same piercing, sucking mouth part that's coiled up inside their head, and they pull it out and then use it to penetrate mycelium. So they're actually sucking mycelium. Really cryptic, understudied, but we do know that they have different responses to forestry practices. Some of them are actually attracted to fire. Some of them are sensitive to clear cutting. Moving on to a new group, the ants. So ants are well known to exhibit that fungal farming behavior that I talked about earlier. But recently there was a discovery of the first ant known to feed on mushrooms, like the macrofungi. So this is the headlines. This was sensational. And the interesting part to me is that the ants had to evolve these really unique adaptations to feeding on mushrooms. So in this species, the ants are nomadic. They migrate to a new location every few days. They nest in cavities rather than constructing their own nests, which is uncommon in ants, but it makes sense with that nomadic lifestyle. They're specialized, so they were found to eat over 30 species in their environment, but they also ignored many. And this is kind of an example of them taking advantage of an underutilized resource, as opposed to those fungus farming ants, where they've evolved this highly specialized obligate mutualism. They can make quick work of mushrooms. This is just, these top photos are just a few hours. And then they chew that up and bring it back to the nest and turn it into a little paste that they ferment and feed their babies. Another cool example, the horntails. This group, it's a type of Hymenoptera. They're all dependent on fungi. They don't actually feed on the fungus, they feed on wood, but they depend on the fungus to sort of pre-digest and tenderize the wood. They also carry spores in little pouches on the female ovipositor. The female larva, when they're, so you can see that top right photo, that when the larva is tunneling through wood, she's actually gathering fungal spores and propagules into pouches on her body in preparation for motherhood, which I'm sure there's more examples of this, but it's one of the only examples I can think of a larva being so prepared for the adult life. Very symbiotic relationship. The fungus is benefiting from cultivation and, you know, inoculation in just the right kind of tree, and the insect is benefiting, of course. Here, I'm just pointing out there's a lot going on in any given mushroom, especially a mushroom at this stage of development or decay. Not totally gone, but not totally fresh either. Here we're seeing some parasitoid wasps that are laying eggs in specific larvae inside of that mushroom. And these wasps have gotten a lot of attention because they're a really important natural biocontrol of cultivated fungi. So in this study, these parasitoid wasps were regulating 98% of the fungus gnat population in shiitake. Okay, my last group, the Thysanoptera. So, boy, where do I start here? I'll start with this mushroom. So this is a mushroom that grows exclusively on the fallen leaves of oak. Nothing more, nothing less. It's a very tiny, delicate fungus. And this other photo is showing, so I teach every year at this women's mushroom conference in Wisconsin called Mycelial Mysteries. And I like to end workshops where we go outside and we find a mushroom and then do this activity where we pass the mushroom around and everybody says one thing about it. And you can do that forever. You can keep passing this mushroom and keep seeing new things. So we were doing this activity with this mushroom, and there was a woman who said, I'm wondering about the little things that are living in this mushroom. And I distinctly remember thinking, that is so sweet that she's thinking of that. But I don't think so. You know, that mushroom is so tiny. I don't know what could survive or live on that mushroom. Okay, so a few hours later, where I'm in this microscopy workshop, and somebody again had brought that mushroom in, and we're looking at it under the microscope as a group, and there were Thysanoptera crawling up and down the stalks, interacting with each other, going forward and backward. And I had never heard of thrips on mushrooms. I thought of them as kind of a pollinator. You know, you hear about them as being possibly the earliest pollinators. You can see one on a flower here next to a bee. But actually over 50% of them are mycophagous. Some of them specialize on spores, some of them specialize on mycelium. They have all kinds of interesting behaviors. Yeah, I'll just show you a couple more pictures. This is one where The males and females exhibit parental care. And the males have these huge biceps that they use for fighting. And they have all kinds of fighting moves that people have documented. They do these pinching things and stabbing and flipping each other. And yeah, all of this on the underside of an oak leaf. Dead oak leaf. Okay. So I'm kind of wrapping up here and talking a little bit about conservation of these groups. So there is so much to discover, so much to discover. And just as an example, this is a study that looked at just one species, the tinder polypore over here, and they collected almost 1,500 mushrooms from one park and documented all of the insects that emerged out of that mushroom. And they found over 500,000 insects from 152 different species, 70 different families in one mushroom in one place. Okay, those numbers really, really amaze me. And I can think of any number of mushrooms in my woods where I could do this same kind of study, and I guarantee I would find new associations, new state records, all kinds of things. Okay, but I am increasingly really uncomfortable with that type of work, at least for myself personally, because of some of the stuff Hope was saying earlier, like these indigenous ways of knowing and respecting the fact that all those things living in these mushrooms, they're fellow beings. And even though I'm so curious, I don't think that it's my God-given right to necessarily know all of that at the cost of taking insect lives. So yeah, I don't know. What I have up here now is We Know Enough to Act Now. I'm taking that from Xerces largely, and a paper that Scott and Emma and another colleague wrote that's talking about declines in insects. We know enough to act now, and we really do. And I think we need to act now. There's a lot of threats to these animals and fungi. Here in northeastern Minnesota, where I live, the threats that keep me up, I know there's so many, but I see a lot of logging. This is right in an area near my house where, I mean, I can remember the mushrooms that grew in this place. And the biggest trees were taken, you're looking at some huge white pines here. This is after the logging, all the slash that was left behind. And I know dead wood is important for fungi, but that's a lot of dead wood that makes it really hard for the plant community to recover. And these areas tend to transition into Canada thistle and tansy, things that love all that nitrogen. So yeah, things like this really make me sad. Invasive species are another thing that are rapidly changing the mushrooming in this area. This is an impenetrable wall of buckthorn in a place that once had tons of diversity in mushrooms. And here an ornamental invasion of some ornamental plants into what was once a pretty intact woodland. I don't know how I'm doing on time, and this slide is a little bit daunting, but did you want me to try to catch us up, Lori, on time?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many questions about fungi, but why don't you finish up and I'll pose one really important one.
Oh boy. Okay. So the message here for you is just there are conservation strategies. This is kind of a back of the envelope sort of list, but I would love to be thinking and talking more about some of this. And I know Cass is following my talk, and I think she'll be talking about some of these. There's some overlap in practices, especially in woodlands that support bees and support fungivores. Some of the questions that I have. So how do we generate more interest and action in this field? Who are the teddy bears of the fungivorous insects? So the charismatic, lovable ones. I would love to know from you all, of those groups that I ran through, who did you connect with? Who would the general public connect with? I'm sure it's not maggots, but maybe some of those beetles. Another question is, who have the best history of collection that we could use to measure potential declines in range or in abundance, or in occurrence? So kind of the poster children for conservation need. And I mean, in our work at Xerces, the bumblebees were very much this group. We had enough of a collection history in order to do these assessments for the IUCN of, who are the most at risk. And I don't have a good sense of, in the fungivorous insect world, who those players might be. My guess, again, is the beetles, because people love to collect them. How do we record some of these associations using non-lethal methods? Again, at Xerces, we did a lot of work with non-lethal pollinator monitoring, which was so cool. I'd love to see that in this field as well. Who are the rock star fungi that support the highest insect diversity and abundance? We talk about this all the time with pollinator-friendly plants. Who are the best plants? Who are the ones that support the most specialists that can't feed on anything else or much else? The rock stars that come to mind for me, one of them is chicken of the woods on the left. You can see a fresh specimen a few days later, full of bugs, all different kinds. And in contrast, something like hen of the woods, everyone knows hen of the woods it just sits there. It doesn't get buggy. It doesn't even really go bad. There's some like antifungal properties, antibacterial properties in that mushroom. So there's differences for sure. Who are the rock stars, human rock stars in the fungal conservation world? So many, and this is also so inspiring to me. So these are just some of my friends doing really cool work in the fungal conservation world, ranging from really local efforts like Lori down here in the middle, who runs an invasive species collaborative here in Duluth, so doing a lot of that buckthorn removal and sort of things. Roomby up above her, who is the director of a new nonprofit in this region that's focused on land access for underserved populations for both growing food and foraging. Gabriella, who runs another nonprofit that's national in scope, focused on conservation of fungi with an emphasis on surveying them to get a better sense of, what is this diversity that we even have. I have to mention Linda, because she founded the Mycelial Mysteries Conference that I told you about, which is actually where I met many of these women, and has just been an amazing mentor in this whole arena. And then, of course, Lori Schneider, who all of you know. And Lori, I know your organization is focused on pollinators, but your love for biodiversity is so deep, and I'm so appreciative of everything you do for this conference and bringing all of us together. And yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. Ditto to you. You were instrumental in getting this conference going. Okay, so here's one question, and we're running super late, so we got to get to Cass. But if you could give some tips to people who harvest mushrooms. I mean, before this, I was thinking, well, first of all, you don't want to over harvest, right? Is that an issue? And what about the gills open, closed? When do the insects come? Should we avoid some that like maybe leave insects? Leaves?
Yeah. Okay, I get the question a lot of, does it hurt a mushroom to pick it? So let's talk from the mushroom perspective first, and then we'll talk from the insect perspective, which I don't get that question really ever. But from the mushroom perspective, generally, it doesn't really hurt a mushroom to pick it. You can think of a mushroom as the fruiting body of a mycelial tree. So it's kind of like picking an apple off of a tree. The insects living in that mushroom, yes, you would be hurting them. And I mean, typically you're seeing mushrooms at a lot of different stages, and you're leaving some that are older and have insects more developed, and you're taking some that are either fresh enough that they don't have insects yet, or in most cases they probably have insect eggs, but you're not going to notice them. But I would say, just in general, recognize that you're taking lives, just like when you're hunting bigger animals, and you know, use some of those indigenous practices. Don't take the first or the last, don't take all of anything, share your bounty, and give back. So give back in terms of being watchful and being, especially with invasives. I'm trying to encourage more mushrooming groups to do invasive removal of some buckthorn and other plants like that, because that's such an important way that we can give back.